only the best art can order the chaotic tumble of events. And there's another line that comes a little bit later that says, the first sentence of every novel should be, trust me, this will take time, but there is order here, very faint and very human. And it was from this mindset of having reread these lines from Michael Ondaatje that I started delving into paper, Mark Kurlansky's book. And it did strike me that this is a chaotic tumble of events in your book, to which you are applying some sort of order. And it is very faint and very human at times, and some of it doesn't seem to relate to each other, but ultimately it is part of a grander narrative. And so I suppose my first question to you would be, how do you even begin to order that chaotic tumble of events?
Yeah, it's on? Yes? Hegel, the German philosopher, said that life was basically rational, and so history was orderly. And I just can't think of anything less true. Either the rational part or the orderly part. Which is why my books are almost always chronological, because that just gives you an order. It doesn't give you a true orderliness, but it gives you, in terms of storytelling, it gives you a direction of narrative. And, unless you're talking about something that doesn't change over history, then it wouldn't be any good at all. But something like paper does change with history, and so that creates the narrative.
I'm interested in your scope and how you define it, because, even basic things like what is paper? I didn't know the difference between paper and vellum and papyrus. How do you begin to decide, with a subject like paper, which does cover millennia and goes all over the world and through various parts of history, how do you define your scope?
Well, of course, this is one of the things that you start with, trying to figure out. And I decided when I started out and was thinking about this, that really what I had to take on was the history of writing. The remarkable, uniquely human quality that we have this urge to record things. So I start in 38,000 BC, which is the oldest human, so it's a red dot on a rock. This is the oldest thing we know of that was done by a human, in this urge to communicate or record or put things down. And I thought it was important to go through this history of the development of writing and language, and the huge event of switching from an oral society to a written society, which turned out for me to be very fruitful, because the response of people to society becoming written sounded so much like what people say about society becoming computerized today. Plato talked about it, about Phaedrus, about how we were going to lose our memories, and how is that somebody who just reads something that was written down, that's not true knowledge, which, is what I think of when I'm talking to somebody and they go and they Google something. I think, well, this person doesn't really know anything. And that's the way Plato felt about people who read in general, although he was a written author. But in his dialogues, he always had the character of Socrates, who was not a written author. He was oral, and so he always championed this orality. So, just huge things changed when they started writing things down. And, we still have the remnants of an oral society, poetry. Poetry really is meant to be spoken, not read. A number of poets like Borges said that, but it's clearly true. It's not about reading, and it has the characteristics that oral literature had, like rhyme and repetition and these things that are memory aids, so that you can pass them on through generations and still remember them. So I felt like you had to go through all of this history before you got to paper, and you had to go through the history of all of the things that were used to write on before they came up with paper. Paper was just the fastest, quickest, best thing anybody came up with to write on, but they had lots of things before that. Papyrus and vellum and parchment and amata, which is bark, beaten bark, and not to mention stone and bones and all these different things. If you look at the history of the Chinese, who were the first to make paper, they went through all of these things first. Stone and silk and bamboo and, before they arrived at paper. They arrived at paper when they really needed it, and that's basically the underlying premise of the book, is that technology is in the service of society, and technology is invented when we need it. Technology that we don't need doesn't go anywhere. It's like people think, this is what I call the technological fallacy, that the idea that somebody invents a technology and will use it because it's invented, and then that will change society. It doesn't work like that. Technology doesn't change society. Society changes and then finds technology to adapt to those changes, which is why whenever you have an invention, you find lots of people inventing. I mean, when Gutenberg was working on the printing press, a whole bunch of people were working on the printing press, and lots of people were working on light bulbs when Edison was, and he wasn't even the first. And Alexander Graham Bell was working on the telephone. A bunch of people, because it was an idea that society wanted and needed, and that's what spurs technology. And it's interesting that we don't really remember inventors. We remember, the people we think of as inventors didn't invent, like Robert Fulton didn't invent the steamboat, and Edison didn't invent the light bulb. And, we've already forgotten about the people who invented computers, It wasn't Steve Jobs, it wasn't Bill Gates. And what we remember is the people who made it commercially successful, that understood what it was society wanted and made it work for them. Those are always the people we remember. And just to bring it back to paper, the man who is the famous inventor of paper, a eunuch in the Han court of China, a Chinese friend said to me that whenever anything important happens in China, they always claim it was done by a eunuch. In 1005, Kai Lun invented paper. Every school kid in China learns this. His picture's everywhere. People have it in their homes. It's very important because the Chinese are extremely proud of what they call the four inventions. They actually invented a lot more than four things, but paper, gunpowder, compass, and printing. And of those four things, the only one where they've attributed to a particular inventor is paper, Kailan, in the 1st century AD. Paper has been found 250 years older, 250 years before the lifetime of Kailan. So he clearly didn't invent it, which raises the question, why is he remembered as the inventor? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I suspect it was because he figured out how to make paper really work in a way it hadn't before, and so it kind of took off.
What you were just saying about inventors being perhaps overlooked or inventions being misattributed or retroactively attributed made me think about this TV show I used to watch called Connections. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It's a little bit obscure, but it was hosted by this winsome, droll Englishman named James Burke. And he would make these connections between seemingly disparate events in history that gave you a through line and showed you how things came to be. And the sort of central thesis of the show was that individuals in history act according to their own needs or what they know of at the time, and they innovate according to what they need, and it's only the accumulation of those innovations or the way that we trace them afterwards that allows us to see how impactful they truly were, because they were only acting within their lifetime, not thinking of how things will be used in the future.
Yeah, and in the service of what they needed in their world. Suppose Charlemagne or somebody in Charlemagne's court had invented a computer. I mean, it would have just sat in a corner of the castle gathering dust. Nobody needed a computer.
Yeah. I mean, with a topic as broad and far-reaching as paper, you get to touch on so many things. You get to touch on art and literature and the written word and technology and even warfare, the media. During the writing of this book, was there any road that you went down that you suddenly thought, oh, this is what this story is about? And did that change?
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot of fun because of what you just said, all these different things that you could that you could get into. And what I realized in doing this is that, paper was adapted by different societies when they were ready for it and not until then. And so that leads you to what kind of society it was and how it operated. I was really into the Arab Spain, which had this society, or the Arab world in general, actually, had this tremendously literate society. Books on everything. Of course, they figured out how to make paper. They even had cookbooks, and they had science books and novels and lots of poetry. Not novels in the modern sense, but stories. And they were also a highly commercial people, so they wanted to sell this stuff to the Europeans. And the Europeans didn't see the point, because the Europeans, well, let me put it like this: the library in Sevilla had 200,000 books. And the Vatican Library, which was considered the greatest library in Christendom, had a couple hundred. A book was a thing beautiful, hand-painted and it was an art object and a prestigious thing, and you'd have one in a castle and one in a monastery. And, I think all of us used to think that, people in those times all knew Latin because all the books were in Latin. Nobody knew Latin, and they weren't reading either. When people started wanting to read, they stopped with the Latin, and that's when they started making paper. So, paper became kind of emblematic of a certain stage of development in society. So when Cortes went to Mexico and found that the Aztecs made paper, he was very impressed by this. Cortes was one of the backwards Christians who had taken over Spain and, inherited this society, this paper society that Arabs had created. And so, paper meant something. And he wrote back, very excited to Spain about how that, that these people are making paper and they're sending messages on paper. And, this is the mark of a certain level of development.
I have a particular fondness for ironic outcomes and unintended consequences. And I'm wondering, an example I have in my mind is in the 1840s, this Hungarian doctor who worked with mothers who were in childbirth was advocating for hand washing, had noticed that doctors who came from working in the morgue and then delivered babies seemed to be associated with these women dying in childbirth, and suggested that perhaps the doctors ought to wash their hands after handling corpses and before delivering babies, because the women were dying of a type of infection, like a puerperal fever. And people didn't take him seriously, and he ended up dying of septicemia, which was essentially the very thing he was trying to prevent. And if people had just listened to him, he perhaps...
The problem was that before Pasteur, people didn't have the concept of germs.
Yeah, this was pre-germ theory.
They didn't understand, that there are these little microscopic things that cause disease.
Yeah. This sort of tragic outcome and the irony of that, I'm drawn to stories like that, and I'm wondering if you have an example from the paper world of an unintended outcome or an ironic one.
Well, paper used to be made from rags. It's really too bad it still isn't, because it was better paper. If you go and look at 500-year-old books, the paper is in better shape than it is in 50-year-old books. But the problem was that rags were hard to come by. And as people became more and more literate and more paper was being used, and then, after the printing press was invented, which caused a lot more paper to be used, and it was really a struggle for rags to keep up with it. So there was always this discussion about, what could you use instead of rags? There were certain things that, Asians used tree bark, mulberry bark, and the British sometimes made paper from a certain kind of grass called spargo, and there was paper made from many different things, but none of it really caught on commercially. But, there was this guy, Réaumur, a French scientist in the 18th century. There's a street in Paris named after him. And he just happened to notice, because he was interested in insects, and he happened to notice that wasps built their nests with this really great material, which they made by chewing up wood. And, he suggested that we could do that too and use this stuff for writing on. And it was just like oh, this guy's weird, you know. And it was, you know, it wasn't until 60, 70 years later that they started making paper from wood in the very way that Réaumur had suggested they do it.
Oh, wow. Whenever I even research an article, I then see the world in terms of the subject I'm researching. I went to the Museum of American Finance the other day, and all of a sudden I was like, the universe revolves around currency. The story of our lives is the story of currency. So I'm wondering, you know, with paper and with your other single subject or commodity-focused books, how does your day-to-day world change when you start to view it in terms of the object you're focusing
Well,
on?
it's, you know, while I'm working on it, it's an obsession. I remember, you know, when I was working on my cod book, I just saw cod everywhere. I said, oh, look, cod. Oh, no, that's God. You know, it's, yeah, when I was working on the paper book, it was, paper was everywhere. It does sort of it takes over your mind. It takes a tremendous amount of concentration to write a book.
Yeah, I mean, I've written one book. It took me 4.5 years, and I spent many of those 4.5 years just sort of lying on the ground and flailing and complaining that the book would never be finished. But as an author of some 30 books, I have to assume that not a lot of your time has been devoted to flailing.
No, but in fairness, just because I never thought of it, you know, I may try it now. Yeah, but you have to, yeah, it has to take over your mind. First of all, the kinds of books I do and the way I do them involve gathering so much information and figuring out how to put it together. And you can only do this by thinking about it all the time. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm out walking my dogs, and that's what I'm thinking about. And people complain to my wife. They say, oh, I saw your husband. He wasn't very friendly, you know, thinking about my book. It's an extremely, you know, if you don't approach it in that sort of intense way, you'll never get it all put together.
Yeah. This is a problem I'm having at the moment. I'm working on a book. It's only at the proposal stage, but it's about a particular period of American history from the 1890s to the 1920s, and a particular aspect of it. And I do all this research on it, and the more I research, the more I feel like I have to find out.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm never going to get to the end of that process.
No, you do. You do. What happens eventually is that you find that you're not finding anything new anymore. Mm-hmm. Or this is like when I was a newspaper journalist. I was working on a story. I knew I had the story when everybody I interviewed sounded the same. You know, you have to, you have to take in an enormous amount and sort of explore little avenues and side streams and stuff. But you eventually reach a point. I think you know when you reach a point when you. But then you have this big problem of getting it all into your manuscript.
Yeah.
And that is the hardest thing. It's like I have this tradition when I finish a first draft, which is generally pretty bad, but the point is it has everything in it. You know, that's such a relief to just have it all in there, and then, you know, fixing it is just a writing problem. It's fine. And I have when I finish that first manuscript, I blow a conch shell, which my first book was on the Caribbean, and blowing a conch shell was originally a signal for a slave uprising, but has become in the Caribbean a signal for, it's a symbol of freedom. So I Yeah, 30 times I've blown a conch shell. And you know, one time we used to spend a lot of months of the year in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And I finished this book once in Gloucester, and I didn't realize I was going to be finishing it there, so I hadn't brought any conch shells with me. And I thought, oh, damn. And in the house I rented, I was wandering around in the garage, and damn it if there wasn't a conch shell there.
Wow, that means something. That
Right.
seems fated. I'm very curious about your approach to history in general, because I feel like we see history as a series of these key events. You know, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, things like that we regard as having particular significance, that the world would not be as it is now if these things had not happened, or if they had happened in a different way. And in your books, there's this sense that things that were on the periphery, or things that seemed inconsequential or just sort of there day to day, now take a center stage. It's kind of like taking a side character and making it the protagonist.
Well, it's kind of like biology, like evolution, you know, that things, you know, you said unintended consequences. That's actually a biology term, the law of unintended consequences, that there's a variation and you have no idea where it's going to go. And I mean, history is kind of like that. History is, in the long run, is not predictable. In the short run, it seems very predictable. But the thing about books on history is that a book is telling a story. So it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But history has no beginnings and no ends. History just flows. And so this is the problem that I always have with history books is, you know, where do you begin? That's how I ended up in 38,000 BC. You know? It was funny with this book on paper because this was a book that somebody had proposed to me. People propose books to me all the time, and I never do them. They say, have you done a book yet about lettuce? And, but I liked this idea the more I thought about it. And originally what attracted me to the idea was it was a story that actually had a beginning and an end, I thought. You know, the beginning is Kai-Lun, and the end is the end of paper being replaced by electronics. And then I came to understand that it didn't begin with Kai-Lun, and we really don't know who it began with or when it began. So all the old pieces that we found are in the Western, Eastern, I always get directions mixed up in Asia. You know, the coast is east, right. So Western Asia, where it's desert, is where all the ancient paper was found, because the climate in you know, China is a very usually a very humid climate. So it all deteriorates. So, you know, there may have been paper from 500 BC. We don't know. So there goes my beginning. And the end was completely shot, too. It's you know, paper isn't disappearing. It's nowhere near disappearing. I don't know anybody in either the paper industry or the computer industry who expects computers to replace paper. It was never intended to replace paper. It was intended to store information. You know, a few years ago, publishers were very excited about ebooks, you know, and this was supposed to be the end of books. You know, my agent would say things to me like, do you realize that the number of ebooks sold increased by 100% last year? Well, you know, if you sold one and then you sold two, there it is. So it got to a certain point, and it hasn't gotten past there because people like books, you know, and that, you know, is something that people also tend to miss about technology is that technology rarely replaces other technology. I mean, sometimes it does, but not very often. It took a couple thousand years for paper to replace papyrus, and parchment is still being used. And British laws are still published in vellum.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Some guy in Parliament suggested that they publish them on paper because it'd be a lot less expensive, and everybody was horrified. I mean, vinyl record sales are going up and up. This idea that because there's a new technology, I mean, radio was supposed to disappear with television, and it usually doesn't work that way. So what technology usually does is create an alternative. And, ebooks are a perfect example of that. So if you want, some people like ebooks because for traveling, and some people like them for certain kinds of books, but not other books. Kids don't like ebooks at all. They like books. And, so now they have this other alternative, and you can do one or you can do the other, or you can do both. And that's, that's technology working. We panic too much about, things disappearing and things being replaced. And so anyway, I was completely wrong about thinking the paper would disappear. It's not disappearing at all. And it's what is that movie called about Edward Snowden? The documentary. Yes. Yeah. Did you see that? Remember at the end of the movie, and during the movie, they're using encryption and all these things. They're right in front of each other, but they're doing encrypted messages on laptops and all this stuff. And as they get more and more paranoid, by the end of the movie, what are they doing? They're writing on paper and then burning the paper. It turns out paper is the most secure. The more hacking that goes on, the more we're going to use paper. It's like the guy who helps me with my computer stuff said, all these codes that you have to have for everything. He said, I hope you're writing them down on paper. Don't put them in something electronic because they can be hacked.
One thing I did notice about the paper version of paper that would not be able to be replicated in an ebook is end papers.
Yes. Well, also the beauty of, we had this meeting about, come on, we got to have nice paper for this book.
Absolutely.
so it's really beautiful paper. And there's a great story about Galfelder, the paper maker who made that paper. It's a company that was founded in 1863 in Pennsylvania. It's still going. And they had, Gladfelder, the same family that owns it, had bought this company at a going out of business sale from a company that had been there before. And the problem with the company that had been there before is this was in the days when paper was made from rags. There was this kind of big battle nearby called Gettysburg. Yeah, they went out on the battlefield after the battle and stripped all the dead to make paper. And so you can imagine people really didn't want that paper. That wasn't good for business. But I started looking into that, and that wasn't a unique thing. In the Napoleonic Wars in Europe, that was often done. I mean, paper makers were desperate for rags.
Amazing. One of the things I think about when writing about history, and I guess it's sort of the flip side of this whole ordering the chaotic tumble of events factor, is there is this desire to make a sort of neat story and to ascribe meaning or profundity to seemingly random events, link them all together in a neat narrative. And I do sometimes wonder if I'm imposing a modern view on history, or like trying to make things matter more than they actually did at the time, misrepresenting them perhaps. How do you handle that when you write about history, the desire to make it all into a neat story?
Well, I mean, I don't really worry about it being a neat story as long as it's just a good story. So, you know, a good beginning, middle, and an end. I started off as a playwright, and I tend to see books as 3-act plays. And if you have a story that works in a 3-act play format, that's all I want. And it doesn't have to be neat or tidy, but just, you know, and then there is this thing that happens that if you take something like paper and you look at it in history, you'll find it everywhere. You know, it becomes sort of like, remember the movie Forrest Gump?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it becomes like that. It's just paper is everywhere. And then you have to start making decisions about, you know, you can't just go with everything you find, or you got to find what are the best things. And when I did my book on salt, for years afterwards, still today, I hear from people who complain because they live near some salt work that they're very fond of that is not in my book. You know, and you know, you can't do salt in 12 volumes. People like that book to a strange degree, but I think there would be a limit. You know?
Yeah.
So you do have to make you have to make those decisions of and different places, you know, because almost every place has a paper history. When I was doing salt, literally every place has a salt history, either because of the salt they produced or the salt they needed that they didn't produce. So you know you have to make choices, and it's all about those choices you make. Another good thing about my theater education was that in theater you learn about that idea of aesthetic choices. You know, like a set is not everything in the world. I mean, it's you have to make choices. You have to make choices in a costume, often based on the silhouette of the costume. When you write a play, you have to, you know, unless you're doing one of these 12-hour real-life kind of plays, usually, you know, you have to make a lot of choices about what's included and, you know, what happens on stage and what happens off stage. And, you know, all these things are a great exercise for book writing because you also have to make those choices in writing a book.
Has your writing process with all of these history books changed your sense of who and what is responsible for making history?
Well, I'll tell you, this is what I've been thinking about history. You know, I wrote a book about the year 1968. I was a college student in 1968, and you know, I talked to a lot of people. I used to talk to Tom Hayden, who was a student activist who died recently. We used to talk about how, you know, we have to get all this stuff down because they're not getting it right. And what's happened to me since I came out with that book is I have been in situations like panel discussions and interviews with people and involved with people, younger people who are historians who have studied the 60s. they don't have it right, you know? And how could they? Because they weren't there. And then I realized, you know, most of history we weren't there. All these things I'm writing about, I wasn't there. How can I write about the Roman Empire? What can I know about what the Roman Empire was like? So, you know, this is the big problem with history.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that lately because, you know, we are living at a time where it seems like every day something unprecedented and dramatic and astonishing happens, and I do wonder what people will think about what's happening now in 10 or 20 or 100 years. And I do often think about, you know, when I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, just thinking about what is day-to-day life like in these periods of time that we regard as especially historic. You know, people still have to live their lives.
Yeah, and the human factor is what sort of gets lost in history often. I've been researching something about Hemingway, something offbeat, but it involved my reading all the biographical literature on Hemingway. And, you know, there's such a difference between the books by people who knew him and the books by scholars. And the scholarly books, you know, are often more accurate in a way because the people who knew him, you know, they loved him too much.
Right.
But there's also something missing from the scholars. It's like, you know, we used to have this expression in journalism, a graveyard of facts. You know, history can be that if you lose the human element. And so you don't know. Is this an air raid, a fire drill, or is it time to stop?
Is this a historic moment? Bo.
You know, so the times we're living in, you know. So imagine, you know, 100 years from now, people will look back, you know, on the 200 days that this weird guy Trump was president before he was impeached. And it'll be this weird blip in history. And they'll have no idea how traumatic it was to live through it.
I was wondering how long it would get before we mentioned that name. Yeah.
We held off for
I knew
quite
it would
a while.
come up. Yeah. Is there a particular figure or a narrative, a historical narrative that we've gotten wrong that you would like to take this opportunity to redress?
Oh, geez, probably a lot, but I have to, you know, I would have to, I don't know if I can come up with this off the top of my head. Well, I mean, first of all the narratives about war are wrong. World War II, for instance, I'll bring this up. This is, you know, in my career of 30 books, this is the one thing that gets people angry. I fail to make people mad except when I talk about World War II. So, you know, this idea that it was an inevitable war and that it was a moral war ignores the fact that there was absolutely no effort to stop the Holocaust. And it ignores the fact that there was absolutely no effort by Churchill or Roosevelt or anybody to have the Germans stop doing what they were doing in the 1930s. We were, in fact, all trading with them and supplying them with arms. And this is history that's, I guess, not vanished, because I know about it, so probably some other people know about it, but it's pretty buried. You know, all sorts of things like that, you know, like John McCain wrote, everybody goes, oh. He wrote this editorial, which was intended to be anti-Trump, in the New York Times, about how wrong it is not to have a human rights policy and not to have American foreign policy based on human rights. And he proceeds to talk about all of the great stands that Ronald Reagan took on human rights. Well, sorry, but it was Jimmy Carter who took stands on human rights, and Ronald Reagan who obliterated those stands, saying it has no place in foreign policy. So, politicians are the worst source of history.
That seems completely valid. So you have been the salt guy and the cod guy, and now the paper guy.
Yeah, I'll tell you this. Politics and Prose, very good bookstore in Washington, D.C., and I almost always do a reading there for every book. And my sister lives in Washington, and she always goes to these readings. And I said to her once, don't you find it weird that I show up here every year and it's the expert on Jews? No, now it's the expert on salt. No, he's on fish. She said, oh, I sort of like it. It's like, who's he going to be this year?
Yeah. So what's next?
Well, my next book is actually finished, and it's about milk.
Yes.
Which was not a book I had planned to do. A magazine a very interesting magazine called Modern Farmer had asked me to do something about milk. And I said, well, what about milk? And they said, well, calves cry when they're separated from their mothers. I thought, oh, okay, well. So I went around and I asked a bunch of farmers, and some said they did, some said they didn't. Some said some calves do and other calves don't. And ended up doing a story about something completely different, about how all of these things that people are interested in, like grass-fed and hormone-free and no GMOs and all these things, organic, to dairy farmers, what they are is potential opportunities for a higher price. I'll do this, I'll do that. People like it. It's Ronnybrook, which some of you may know. It's very good milk here in New York. It's just a little bit upstate. And his milk is GMO-free. And I said, so do you think GMOs are harmful? He said, I don't think so. I don't know. It's just people don't like them. So that's sort of what my article was about. And then my long-standing editor talked me into turning it into a book. So, of course, the book goes back to 38,000 BC again.
Of course. I love it. At Atlas Obscura, where I work, many of us are known for having, beyond our official beats as writers, we have our own little passions. Like one of our staff writers, Cara, is obsessed with blimps and dirigibles in general, and she has this whole philosophy about why humans are drawn to them. She says that it's sort of reminiscent of megafauna, that when she sees a blimp in the sky, it's as though she's seen a woolly mammoth or a whale, and she feels like there's a benevolence.
But they look happy.
They look happy, and she wants to say thank you for visiting us.
Oh, this reminds me, by the way, of my favorite paper story.
Please, go on.
This is a story that's so bizarre that I spent a lot of time checking it out, because I thought, no, somebody must have made this up. But they didn't. I even found eyewitnesses to it. So during World War II, after the Allied bombing of Tokyo, and all these Japanese generals decided, they got together and said, we got to do something to really shake up the Americans now that they've bombed Tokyo. We got to show them something that'll really freak them out. And what they came up with was bomb-dropping balloons. And the thing about these balloons is they were made with handmade Japanese paper. And Japanese paper is incredible, and it has very long fibers, so it's really, really thin but strong. You can't tear it. So it was just ideal stuff for balloons, because they would be really lightweight, but they wouldn't tear. So they released something like 5,000 balloons with bombs in it to cross the Pacific to the United States. And about 1,000 of them made it. Most of them landed in the western part of the U.S. One of them made it as far as, I think, Minnesota. They would just sort of, you'd see this weird-looking thing flying overhead, and then there'd be a boom over the next rise, and you'd go there to see what happened, and you'd find nothing but scraps of paper. And the only fatal incident was in Oregon, where one failed to explode, and some people went over and were messing around with it, and then it exploded. None of the other ones did. But, I mean, this is how the world has changed. The War Department told the press, don't write about this. Don't say anything about it because it'll cause a panic. Okay, says the press. So it was never reported on. So you could go in newspaper archives, you'll find nothing about this. Which is why I thought, maybe this is just made up. I found out about it because an aviation historian at the Smithsonian did write about it. And I've since found people who actually saw these balloons, explode and went and saw the scraps of paper and stuff. It's an absolutely true story about Japanese handmade paper balloons, the Japanese handmade paper campaign of World War II.
I have a brief coda to that story from the other side, which is that a freelance writer brought me a story a few months ago about he'd found a declassified memo written by the American side during the Second World War that detailed a plan to dye Mount Fuji black to destroy Japanese morale. Never happened, obviously. It seemed like a plan that would never be able to be carried out.
Well, that's what, I don't remember now, but the Japanese meeting where they came up with these balloons, they had about 50 other crazy ideas that were tossing around. The CIA had all of these plans for Fidel Castro, the one with the cigar that would make his beard fall out. And, these were grown-ups really planning these things.
Yeah. I see Bo hovering. How are we doing on time? Okay, cool. Well, I feel pressure now to come up with a profound final question. The whole, what have you learned is a sort of cliche wrap-up question, but is there something that you've taken away from the process of writing this book that...
Well, yeah, I mean, this whole idea about the technological fallacy is what I learned from doing this book. I saw it by the way paper spread. By the way a society was not interested in paper until they needed it, and then I started reflecting on it, and I went back, I read Heidegger. Heidegger had a famous essay about technology in which he said a technology is a means to an end. But yeah, doing this, actually I don't think I've ever done a book that changed my thinking as much as this book, because it just really completely changed the way I view the role of technology in the world.
Nice. What do you think, the technological fallacy, is that a technology is introduced and then it changes society? Yeah,
the technology comes out of nowhere and changes society.
Right. That seems to be a prevalent belief.
It is. It's very prevalent. You hear people talk about it all the time. We were talking about the self-driving cars. And everybody's talking about how the self-driving cars are coming, and maybe they are coming, but nobody, including the people who are working on these projects, seems to be asking the question, do people want self-driving cars? I suspect it'll be like e-books. Some people want them and other people won't. A lot of people really like to drive. But it could turn out that nobody wants them. It's why is the technology being developed? It's usually being developed because there's a demand for it. Sometimes it's developed because it's there, and there's somebody in a laboratory or something who just gets fascinated with it. And those things don't always take off. Or often what will happen is they get invented and nobody cares, and then years later somebody else understands how this would suit society if you did it in a certain way, and then it takes off. The French have this incredible history of inventing everything and failing to commercialize anything. The automobile, the camera, film, the machine to make paper was invented by a Frenchman, but first used by a British company, and the machine the printing machine, the mechanical printing, the first in the end of the 17th century, the first invention of the printing press since Gutenberg. I mean, basically all the centuries they're just using Gutenberg's press, and the French invented this, powered printing press, but never used it. And the British said, "That's a good idea. We'll do it."
I like to imagine a lot of alternate universes in which these things did happen and are continuing to happen.
Right.
One of our writers, Kara, the one who's into blimps, recently wrote a story. She'd found a patient, a woman in the 1930s had registered a patient for a skeleton that you would confess your crimes to, in theory. It was an interrogation skeleton, and it had glowing red eyes. Never took off, but I like to imagine there's a universe in which it did.
I think they should work on it. There's something missing from it. If they find the thing that's really, like the skeleton can then correct your mistake, then I think it could sell.
All right, interrogation skeleton.
Right.
You heard it here first.
Right. But, this Italian guy in Cuba invented the telephone before Alexander Graham Bell, but he didn't have anybody to call. And,
That's so tragic. Man. Yeah, I have a lot of empathy for those overlooked inventors.
Yeah.
Those whose invention came before its time.
Yeah. But most inventions actually came before their time, and, somebody else ended up getting credit for them.
Yeah.
For this book, I don't know, China, Japan, Colombia, bunch of places in Western Europe, Italy, Spain, England. My milk book even more. But I travel a lot, and I'm now of an age where a lot of friends are saying to me that they're going to retire. And I said, "Well, what are you going to do when you retire?" And they say, "I'm going to travel." And I think, well, what should I do when I retire?
Yeah.
Just for the next question, please wait for the microphone. You projected fantastically, but not everybody else does.
This one in the back.
How bad is paper production environmentally?
Oh, great question. Thank you. Well, there's a couple of things. In terms of pollution and toxic chemicals, that's a real problem, except that they have ways of recycling and reprocessing those chemicals so that they're not harmful, but it's extremely expensive. So what happens, it's one of these counterintuitive things. Big, huge industrial paper makers are less polluting than small paper makers because they can't afford these processes. But the other thing about, pay your bill electronically, save a tree, for the environment, you're just saving them a stamp. It's a battle that's been won. It was a terrible problem. In 1863, started making paper from wood, And for most of the rest of the 19th century, they were just laying waste to virgin forests everywhere, and then tropical rainforests, terrible. That is really almost not at all done anymore. The wood for paper pulp is farmed, and it's a very sustainable production. So, you know, if you want to do something on paper and you have somebody telling you you shouldn't for the environment, don't listen to them. It's you know, this idea that, you know, you'll save a tree if you do it electronically. Actually, you could make an argument that electronics and the stuff they do and the byproducts from computer manufacturing is worse for the environment than paper production. But there is still this problem with chemical pollution. Sorry.
I have seen the Oracle Bones, and I think that's incredible that you have your first chapter is talking about writing. And I love the way you connect with, it's not just paper alone, and just a overall arching compliment on this book that you produced. You're not, you know, it's like all together. It's not like they're in compartments separate from one another. They all are, they have to be. The idea of communication is there. But the heart of paper, and you keep on saying going back into rag, they still make rag paper. I'm an artist and I use rag paper.
Yeah.
100% rag or whatever percent. Acid-free,
Right.
you know, all this is because it's archival. It also has certain qualities. When you paint on something, and there's certain artists have used certain papers to get special effects, or they're particular to their work.
Yeah, you know, you're talking about how has doing the book changed me. I do a lot of artwork. I illustrate a lot of my books and stuff, and I do a lot of linoleum block printing. And my whole linoleum block printing world changed when I went to Japan and researched paper. I mean, Japanese paper is just so incredible for doing that.
Yeah, there's certain papers that have a special way of it is, you know, it's certain things you adapt. Like you're talking about even writing a book about milk, and I just after I guess about 6 years ago I came across the paint medium of casein, which is milk based and is a very ancient material that was used, but also through the years it has been used for other realms. But it is that's another interesting element. But what it does and how it reacts to certain paper. But as paper goes, in the high end of paper, and I'm thinking about when the British or even Italians have used watermarks in their paper and produced.
Yeah, well, watermarks were an Italian invention. You know, what we now call branding. So that, you know, if there was somebody whose paper people really liked, they could know where to go for it. And of course, then everybody just stole that watermark. You know, so lots of people would come.
Like, see that this is that.
No, but other people would. I mean, I'm talking about in the 13th century when they first invented watermarks. You know, if there was a very successful watermark, everybody started using it.
I'm one of your biggest fans of your book, Salt. So could you tell us what your inspiration was and how that got started?
Salt. Well, you know, it really came out of the book I did on cod. And, you know, realizing that you could not have a commercial fishery. A commercial fishery was worth a lot of money, created a lot of wealth. Couldn't do it unless you had salt. And the things that various countries were doing to get salt so they could have these fisheries just started me thinking about how important salt was. And the, you know, I talked about how a book should have a story. I love the story of salt. The story of salt is this thing that, you know, just everybody, once you move past hunter-gatherer, everybody needs salt. And you can't have international trade without salt. This was before refrigeration. And then eventually you get refrigeration, but what really does it in is they discover the relationship between salt domes and oil. And then they go crazy looking for salt domes to find oil. And they discover, oh, geez, there's a lot more salt in the world than we ever thought. The value of salt, boom. So the great thing about this story is that the things that we think are of value, what makes them valuable? Will they always be valuable? Don't things lose their value? And there's an interesting thing here that George Bush read my salt book and used to talk about it a lot. It's like other writers get Obama, but and I wondered if he was interested in salt because he had roots in the oil business. And, this lesson that things aren't valuable forever. Because to me, that's the great story about salt. There's something worth learning there. I don't know if he learned it.
Any other questions? Yeah. There's a microphone right behind you. There you go.
Thanks. Can you write a book about paper without writing a book about ink and implements?
Yes, you can.
I was worried.
I do discuss the invention of ink, and I discuss the invention of the brush and the pen. And in fact, I use the brush as an example of this idea of a technological fallacy. This guy, Xin Ming, in the 3rd century AD, actually the guy who first started the Great Wall of China, invented the camel hair brush. And, there's a lot of calligraphy and a lot of painting and stuff going on. And so, some people said, oh, this stuff really took off after he invented the brush. It's completely wrong. This stuff was taking off, and that's why he invented the brush. But I'm not going to do a separate book on it. You got to have some discipline and control,
Just a moment.
I was recently talking to an author who said that the publishing industry is sort of on the upswing from everything that's happening in the current state of affairs. But have you come across anything in your paper research that would show that paper is sort of surging as well in connection with that, or?
The paper is surging? I mean, certain kinds of paper are and other kinds aren't. Books, basically, are doing okay.
Okay.
I wouldn't say they're surging, but they're doing okay. What is going through the roof is packaging, paper for packaging because of online shopping. And there are certain things that are in definite decline, like newsprint, which was for newspapers and for telephone books and catalogs. And telephone books and catalogs are really an example of something that's going to be replaced by the computer because it's about storing information. It's purely informational. If you have something that's purely informational, then the computer makes sense for it. So newsprint, which used to be the backbone of a lot of paper mills, the cheapest kind of paper, but huge volume, and that business is really dying. But other things are doing okay. Stationery, for some reason, seems to be doing really well. Isn't that interesting? So everybody doesn't email. And a lot of magazines are in trouble, but fashion magazines are doing great. Nobody wants eVogue. So, that's another lesson about technology, is that there's winners and there's losers.
Any other questions?
One more question?
One more question. Over here, right on the right.
This is for both of you. How often, or how much do you write every day, like when you're working on your books?
I have an office sort of across the street from where I live in Manhattan, and I go there every day about 8:30, and I leave every day around 9 o'clock at night, 8:30 or 9 at night. I do a little less on the weekends, but I have to go every day because I rescued a cat. And put him in my office, so I have to feed him every day. But I do write every day. And, during that time, I'm not always writing because, writers are brilliant about, procrastination. And so I have a treadmill in my office, so I can run a couple of miles. And that's how desperate you get not to write, And I have a couple of dogs that I take for a walk. Come on, want to go for a walk? Come on. And I have a cello. I play the cello. So I do have these little diversions. So I don't know. I guess I write 8-9 hours a day. Why, you might ask? I'm asked that all the time, so I've been forced to think about it. And I don't, it's kind of odd, isn't it? I mean, basically what I'm doing is I'm sitting alone in a room talking to myself. And that seems to make me happy. And that's the only explanation I have.
I'm starting to see why you've written 30 books and I've written one. Because my routine is I'm the worst role model ever for any other writer because I adore research. It's one of my favorite things ever, but I hate writing, but I love having written, which I'm sure is a common complaint from writers. So when I was writing the Atlas Obscura book, I spent the majority of the day researching. And then I got to that point where all my sources were saying the same thing. So I had to start writing, but I had to have a book manager who was emailing me every so often saying, "Where is it?" That was the only thing that would force me to write. So I spend most of my day researching. There's a frenzy at the end where I write as fast as possible and grimace and cringe and not look at it. And then I'll read it the next day and go, "It's all right. It's not bad." Yeah.
Yeah, see, I don't need deadlines or anything like that because writing is my only source of income. And you don't get paid till you hand it in. So that's a great inspiration too.
I'm working on my own book on weekends, which is why it's taking so long.
All right.
All right.
Thank you all for being here. Can
Thank
we get
you so much.
a round of applause for Mark,